second. Hello and good evening, good afternoon, or good morning, wherever you are in the world. And thank you for joining me again on another very interesting discussion with Susan Langlois. I hope I've pronounced that correctly, from Canada. And what we're focused on is that we're focused on the standard regulatory processes with regards to vaccines, and how far have we gone from that with regards to the COVID-19 pandemic. And that's a very, very interesting question, because you can't know how far you've deviated if you don't know what was the standard before. So we have a tremendous pleasure to be able to talk to her, because I've been reaching out to people for a long time. And so I really appreciate that she's willing to share this kind of expertise and share what she is known with so many years of experience at this level, dealing with Health Canada, the FDA, in the pharmaceutical industry. So it's a tremendous honor to have her here with us today, and we'll try and answer as many questions as we can. So hello, Susan, how are you?
I'm very good. Thank you, Philip. Thank you for having me on.
Excellent. So I think the first thing that we need to do is get you to do an introduction so people know who you are and why you are able to talk about this topic.
Okay, well, thank you. So I started my career in 1972, and I had graduated as a lab technologist with a medical option. And I started my career with Connaught Laboratories. Now, a lot of you in the industry probably know about Connaught. They've been around for a long time, since World War One. They specialized in biologicals, so vaccines, antitoxins, blood products, insulin, antibiotics, all biological products and medical devices that incorporated biologics. So when I started at Connaught, I thought I would spend my whole career in the lab. And I spent the first 4 years in quality control as a technician. And then in 1976, the Department of New Product Coordination, which is now known as Regulatory Affairs, was established to make sure that the company was complying with all these new regulations that were coming from Canada. And then we were also marketing in the US, and we were marketing all over Europe. So my role, and there were only 3 of us in the department, was a brand new department. I started off in regulatory affairs in 1976, and I've been involved in regulatory affairs for the rest of my career. I retired 6 years ago. So I spent a lot of time at Connaught, 20 years, and saw a lot of products taken from the bench all the way to marketing and then post-marketing. And after the 20 years, I decided to use that biologics regulatory experience that I've had, because I was the head of the department. I left the company as director of regulatory affairs, which was the highest level within that department. And I was the responsible head for the company, which is the person that's responsible for all product releases, recalls, clinical trials, all regulatory inspections. So that was my role. So I took that and started to work with some startup biologic companies. So the first one I joined was producing a red blood cell substitute in Toronto. I'm based in Toronto. And I spent quite a few years there getting them through the clinical trials, and then moved on to a medical device company, startup again in Canada. And that medical device was a medical device that was also treating blood for therapeutic purposes. So I spent a lot of time there. And in both those particular companies, I was not only responsible for regulatory affairs, but clinical trials and quality, which included quality assurance and quality control. I was
Wow.
also I was I was also involved in a number of other projects, but we'll talk about that as we go through this podcast.
I think that's a tremendous setting the stage, Susan, because I think this is part of the thing is that you've had so much experience in this field for so many years, seeing all the transitions, that this is why I thought that it would be such an insight to get what's, where we are today. But before I do, I want to ask you, with all that year of experience, what was your highlight? Was there anything that stood out to you in that time?
Yes, and it doesn't take me much to recall that. It was the time when I was in Connaught Laboratories. A number of scientists and doctors decided to try the use of BCG vaccine, which is a vaccine against tuberculosis for the treatment of interstitial cancer within the bladder. And they did some trials, and they had a whole number of specialists, urologists, and oncologists approach our company, and it was given to me as a project. So I worked with that group, and we got the vaccine approved for therapeutic use in Canada and the US. And we were the first to get BCG vaccine approved for that therapeutic indication. Then several years later, when I was working with Prostate Cancer Canada, and a number of urologists were talking about the therapy that they were using to this day, and that was just 5 or 6 years ago, for the treatment of bladder cancer, they mentioned it was the BCG. And then somebody said, do you realize that Susan here is the one that actually got that approved in Canada and the US? And they said, so you're the BCG lady. And that just made me so proud that I was involved in something that impacted so many people and was still in use and is still the standard today for treatment of bladder cancer.
It is, and up to recently, I saw a patient getting their treatment with BCG for their bladder cancer. So it's tremendous. So you are the BCG lady. Oh wow, that is wonderful. So, where do we start with regards to the standards that are normally in place with regards to vaccine development? Why are they there? What made them appear? Where do we start with that?
Well, I mentioned that I started in regulatory affairs back in 1976, and that was after polio vaccine had already been on the market and several other products had been on the market, and they were basically grandfathered. So when you think of polio vaccine, it took a long time to develop those vaccines, and there were two of them, and it was based on a knowledge of what the disease did and what the virus was and how to develop an immune response to it. So there was the oral polio vaccine, and there was the injectable, the intramuscular vaccine. And there's risks and benefits to both those products. And there were some other problems with the regulatory system. Thalidomide, if you remember that, it took a long time for that to come off the market for treatment of morning sickness in pregnant women because it was affecting the fetuses. The babies were born with deformities. So the regulations really started to ramp up around 1976. And they created regulations for biologics because vaccines, so I'm going to describe biologics and drugs. Biologics are a lot different from a pharmaceutical drug. And that's because it's a live organism. It usually starts with a live organism. And every batch is different because you're dealing with biological products. You're dealing with a lot of variability. And so the biologics are controlled much more than drugs. And then you have vaccines, which are also a biologic. And the reason why they're controlled even more is because they're given to healthy people, whereas drugs are given to people that are already sick and need a treatment. vaccines are given to healthy people. So the safety of those products are paramount. So you're making sure that the risk benefit of a vaccine is very well controlled. And so you're monitoring them all the time. There's lot releases. So those regulations came into place very early in the 70s, and they have remained very similar throughout the decades. They really haven't changed much, and we can get into the details of what that entails.
I wanted to just pause you on that point there. It stood out to me. The vaccines are given to healthy people, and that's why you have to make sure that they are so safe. Just expand that concept. That's a really important point. What does that mean?
Well, you're talking about people that haven't contracted the disease. So let's say it's the polio vaccine. You have to look at a number of children. A lot of vaccines begin with children. So you're looking at children and what is their risk of getting polio. And but at the time you want to protect them from being infected with polio, they are healthy. There's nothing wrong with them. So you have to be sure that what you're giving them doesn't cause them to be sick or doesn't cause them to have some long-term effects, because not every person is going to be infected with polio. But what you're trying to do is to protect the masses so that no one gets infected, basically. That's what you're trying to do. But at the time you give that vaccine, you're giving it to people that are healthy and you're trying to prevent them from being sick. Whereas drugs are given to people that are already sick. So the risk benefit in that situation is a lot different from a risk benefit for a vaccine.
But that is outstanding explanation. I think that is so critical to understand, especially, and we'll come to this a little later on with regards to children and COVID-19 and the vaccine and so on. But that principle really is critical because that's how you judge the risk benefit. Okay, so before we come to that, let's extend a little bit further into how why does it take so long to make a vaccine? Because I remember hearing some time ago, I think it was Dr. Forsey was speaking about it takes 10 years to develop a vaccine from start to it being ready. Why does that process normally take so long?
Okay, well let's start with, first you have to determine there's a need for a vaccine, because manufacturers aren't going to make products that will not be used and sold. So you need to decide what particular diseases are causing enough health problems in the community at large. Then you have to understand that disease. So if it's a virus or bacteria, you have to understand what part of that virus actually causes the disease, and at what point, what part of that virus is actually causing the immune response. So you have to understand the disease. So there's a lot of research that goes into that. Then you have to make small batches and test it in animals for safety, for immunogenicity, all types of tests that look at pharmacology. That itself can take a year or two when you do these studies. Then you start the regulatory process. You submit all those data to the regulator, and that supports your first phase one, which is usually a safety study looking at probably the highest safe dose. So you do dose escalation. So you would do a number of people that they're healthy and they sign up for this, and you do a safety study. Now you have to analyze all the data, and those data, usually you have to monitor those people for several months, looking for delayed adverse events. And then those data have to be all correlated, analyzed, and then submitted to the regulators. You then have to design your phase two. And the phase two is a smaller effectiveness study. The effectiveness study is where you look at antibodies, the immune response to whatever you are injecting, and the safety profile of that particular product. That can take another year or two, because you're asking healthy people to come into this trial, and you're taking blood work and urine samples and doing a number of things, as well as watching whether or not the immune system starts to wane. You want to know, where do you boost? So if you're looking at boosters, you need to know when the antibody drops off. So then you take all those data, and through these processes, the regulators are auditing those trials. They're actually going to clinical sites and making sure you're following the good clinical practices and that the records are clean. Then you go to your phase 3. And the phase 3 for vaccines are what you call efficacy. So effectiveness is looking at antibody response, and efficacy, you actually go into an endemic area and you have placebo-controlled studies with thousands of people, and you're looking at the efficacy. So what percentage of that population is actually prevented from getting the disease? Remember, disease is different from infection. Disease is when you get symptoms. Infection, hopefully your immune system is now preventing you from getting disease. So those trials can take several years because you're looking at efficacy, and you have to wait till you get enough actual people that have the disease and the placebo to be able to show a statistical difference between the two groups. Once you've done that, you now have to scale up your process. And biologics, which is what vaccines are, you also have to show consistency of manufacturing, and you have to get an establishment license. So your manufacturing facility also has to be licensed for that process. You can make 20 vaccines, but every process that changes, you need to go through a license application for the establishment. And then you have audits. They have to come and inspect you. They inspect your facilities and the quality control and all the things that you do to ensure that you've got consistency of manufacture. Then you send samples to the regulators, and they test those products to look for consistency. You usually send about 5 consecutive batches, and they all have to pass the test. So then you have to develop a post-marketing strategy and submit that to the regulators, plus your labeling and your advertising. Any promotional work that you want to put out there, you have to get approved. So all of that, 10 years is actually a short period of time. If you're starting from the bench to getting it on the market, all of that has to be done. And you can just imagine how each of those steps will take years in some cases.
That's incredible, and it makes you realize that when I think the discussion was about we need to find a way to speed up this process when we have newer technologies and so on. You can see why, looking objectively at the current standard, you would think to yourself, can't this be done faster? So you've been in this for so long. Can it be done faster? Does it have to take this long? Do we have to go through all those steps?
Well, this is where the regulations actually did change. If there's a product that's deemed to be very unique in that it's going to treat a disease where there's nothing out there for that particular disease, then you can streamline the process. So you can start your phase 1, and let's say you're halfway through the phase 1, you've already submitted to the regulators what your phase 2 is going to look like and what your phase 3 is going to look like. And when you get sufficient amount of data, and both your oversight committees and the FDA or Health Canada or whatever regulator you're going to determines that you have sufficient data, preliminary data, you do an interim analysis, you can then start your phase 2. So basically, instead of like the old way was you finished your phase 1, then you started your phase 2, finished your phase 2, go to phase 3. You could actually stagger these things. You could stagger, but in order to meet all the requirements required to get a product, a vaccine we're talking about, approved, all those steps have to be done. If you weren't in a pandemic, if you weren't in
Yes,
emergency, right?
and
So
this is exactly the point, is that I'm trying to now think, because I'm going to use that expertise that you've just pointed out in terms of knowing all the rules that you have to go through, all the steps, why they're there. And then the question then becomes, we hit a pandemic and you need a vaccine fast. What do you do? That's the bit that I think is I guess that people have questions about, and I guess they're reasonable questions when we look at the standard regulation of 10 years, phase 1 animal studies, phase 2 dosing and efficacy, phase 3 with regards to big studies. And I guess even when you stagger them, that's still 5 years, 6 years. Is that the fastest that it can go? What is the absolute fastest with going through all the regulations? What could it be?
Okay, so I think they've demonstrated that with these emergency use releases. So, what the various regulators have done, the FDA already had a process in place that allowed companies to get their products onto the market in an emergency, and they used it for Ebola and a few other instances. Um, when they're in full, they're still working on a lot of things, so they don't have to get their manufacturing plant approved right away. I think what they're concerned about is safety, and they're making sure that there is enough data available to provide a safety profile that the regulators feel is sufficient in the midst of an emergency. So the US have this regulation in place, and there is no expiry date on it. Companies are approached by the regulators asking them to file applications, or the manufacturers can file them themselves. But the criteria there are the same. In order to get a full approval in the States, you need to give them everything that I just talked about. So while they have an emergency use application or approval, they are still working on their trials. They are still working on getting their manufacturing plant licensed. But all of that is in the background while they're putting the vaccine out there. And in Canada, they established an interim order, which had a 1 year expiry date. So products that are approved through that system, and that's any of them within that year, had products available. That's not just vaccines, but therapeutics available. They would be released the same way, using minimum data, but sufficient data for the regulators to say the product is safe and has some hint of effectiveness. But once that expired, those companies they amended the regulations to allow those companies to legally distribute their products with the expedited submission. They will still need to file more data as time goes by, but this is open to all companies. And the US, once they deem that the emergency is over, then that emergency use approval process will be terminated, and everyone will need to go through the full process. But remember, all those companies that had released through the emergency would be still working on their full submissions to get. So if you hear they got approval, it meant that they complied with all those requirements that I briefly described.
So I think, for instance, there was full approval for Pfizer. I think Moderna just went through. So they would have gone through all of those steps to get full
If
approval.
they, well, I'm not, I can't say whether they went through all the steps. I don't know. I know in Canada they got approval. They would have got it on the basis of the criteria that was in the interim order, which was not as many steps and not as much information, but sufficient to continue. The issue with Canada was the expiry date on the interim order. And if once it expired, those products would not have been able to be legally distributed. So they just switched them over to full approval. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they've met all the requirements that I described that was in the past. In the US, if they got full approval, then it meant that they collected all the data and they had their establishment license approved. Remember, they were put on expedited review, so they jumped the queue. Usually, the other thing is there could be 1,000 applications sitting with the biologics reviewers, and you're going to vote the bottom of the list unless there's emergency. So that's the other thing that happened is they jumped the queue, and all COVID products were put to the top, so that they were reviewed. They were given priority review. So that's happening all over the world too. That's what they do as part of this emergency release.
So, quick question with regards to that. So, say for instance, Pfizer and Moderna, their products were ready fastest. Did everyone, because there were over 200 companies trying to produce vaccines, Was any company preferentially treated, or did the same rules apply to everyone?
No, in the US, as long as the government deems there is an emergency related to COVID, any vaccines or products that have a COVID indication will be considered under the emergency use approval process. In Canada, the interim order has been, so anybody that applied during that 1 year period would all be treated the same as the first ones that got approval. So they didn't give preferential treatment to the first ones that came in. It was anybody that came in with products during that interim order stage. But the important piece is the regulations were amended to allow these fast track submissions, I guess forever, because they amended the regulations to allow any COVID product, even going into the future, would still have those expedited review processes applied. So if
Wow.
there's a new vaccine that comes up next year, they would still use the same process they used under the emergency release interim order process.
So let me just deal with one of the questions here. So I've got a few questions. So Canon had asked this question yesterday. How did the regulatory authorities justify the rationale behind an entirely new approach to vaccination in the form of mRNA technology, which has never been previously authorized for human use? That's a very good question.
It is a good question. And I can't speak on behalf of the regulators. I don't know what the thought process went, except for the fact that it is a technology that allowed those manufacturers to produce their vaccines much quicker than the old processes, the old technology. And so they came to the table first. The regulator would have had to evaluate whatever data that they had and had to be sure that they were confident there was a safety profile there. Remember, you're talking about risk benefit. So in the event that there were all these people being infected with COVID and dying, that risk was quite high at the time that they approved those vaccines. So, I mean, that is what that emergency use process has been put in place for. But I can't answer what went into the thinking of approving a new platform or new technology quickly, other than the risk of the COVID to the community.
So, but it does bring in a different level of complexity, meaning that it's one thing to approve a vaccine that goes through standard processes. Would it have taken even longer for the, say, mRNA technology that had never been used before in terms of vaccines? I mean, they have been trying to do it for some time, but it has never actually gotten to market. Would this still have been extremely difficult outside of the pandemic?
No, they would have used the same process that any vaccine would use. You'd still have to go through all those various phases. You'd still have to show consistency of manufacture. So the regulations don't differentiate between the various technologies. It's a vaccine, so it has to meet all the vaccine requirements, which includes preclinical, which is like animal safety, and then your safety monitoring in the trials.
Wow.
So
So
I
here's
don't,
some.
yeah, it
Go
wouldn't
ahead.
take any longer than any other type of vaccine. It's just in this particular instance, it was used during a pandemic, which allowed them to expedite the availability of those products.
Mm. Here is another question that I guess is a little bit controversial at the moment. Here's a question. This is from Carrie Harris. Why would it take Pfizer 75 years to release data on the clinical trials for the vaccine Comirnaty? FDA didn't seem to have any problem for proving it. So why don't they want to make the information known to the public? So this is an issue that's coming up because the judge has said that this needs to be shared, but both the FDA and Pfizer are resisting sharing the data. What's going on here?
Okay, so I don't know about the 75 years. I don't know why the 75 years, but when you're approved through an emergency situation, it's the FDA that actually, or the government, that approaches companies and brings them to the table and asks if they're willing to make a vaccine or a product available in the emergency. So when they do that, they have to guarantee that all these interim data, remember, these are interim data. They're still running their clinical trials. They're still conducting safety studies. So to release interim data, it would kind of compromise the end result, because you would know what happened in the early studies. You'd be, making judgments. So they have been protected. The data in their submissions are considered intellectual property. They have protection acts in the regulations that prevents those data to be made public. So once it is all approved officially, but I'm talking about the US now, the FDA approves it, they get their full license application approved, then what happens is the requests have to come in for the data, and the FDA have to pull those pieces of data out of this large amount of data, send it to the company, and the company has a month, I think it is, to review it and redact anything that they feel is commercially sensitive, like proprietary information. So they redact it, they send it back to the FDA. The FDA has to look at those redactions and they decide whether they agree with them or not. If they don't agree, they send it back to the manufacturer to do it all over again. Once that's done, then they have to take all those documents through a PDF process and put these redactions in before they can even send it out. And remember, this is through the Freedom of Information Act. So the requests are taken first come, first serve. So there might be millions of requests for informations for other products, but they will handle these on a first come, first serve basis. So to get this, it might be another year or maybe two before these companies get their full approval through FDA. And then this whole process has to be put into motion. So I can't speak to the 75 years, but I can say why they're not releasing the data now. And it's because they are under this Emergency Use Act or approval process.
And why wasn't this just explained, Susan? Because it just makes it seem as though there is something strange going on when there doesn't seem to be clarity as to why. Why can't this kind of thing just be explained to people so they understand the process?
You know, I think the problem is most of society doesn't understand all this. I mean, I have many friends and relatives that had no idea what I was doing. And when I started to talk about regulations and what the government does, they glaze over. They don't want to hear it. It's just too much for them. So I think over the years, FDA, Health Canada, WHO have found it difficult to explain to the general public what the processes are. And it always sounds defensive. Like if they say, well, it's very complicated and this is what, people shut it off. And if you only give one or two sentences, it's not enough. It gets misinterpreted. So I think part of the skepticism, the uncertainty with the public is because they just aren't getting the explanations. But on the other hand, at what media do you use to give those explanations where the general public would understand it?
Interesting point. All right, let's take another question here. Somebody, Susan, had asked, is the testing unit part of the pharma company or a completely separate entity? I think you've kind of dealt with that. Is that the company deals with the trials and then the regulators review it?
Actually, there's a number of, I don't know which testing that Susan was speaking about, but there's several tests. So one is the clinical. Well, quite often companies use external contractors to manage their clinical trials and to do the statistical analyses. So if she's asking the question about that, some companies have clinical departments, full clinical departments, but most of them will contract that out. So that's usually done by an outside firm. And if it's a global clinical trial, then you've got these firms all over the world. If it's the testing of the batches, then yes, the company tests their own batches, but for regulatory approval for vaccines, the government actually receives samples from the manufacturer and also tests them. And they release each batch. So I know in Canada and the US, I'm not really sure. If somebody on here thinks they've got more up-to-date information on that, please just put a comment to Philip. But I believe that they were testing them alongside. Before, it was the company would do their tests, submit the results and samples to the regulators, and then they would do their tests. I think during these emergencies, they were doing them in parallel. They were
Yeah.
testing the samples at the same time to expedite things. So if somebody's talking about testing of the product, it is tested by both the company and the regulators. Vaccines are a batch to batch release.
So I'm going to show you something here, Susan, and this is from somebody called the Flaming Basketball Club. They're very upset. The
Mhm.
pharmaceutical industry should be banned from society. A lot of people are very upset with the industry. Is that fair? Have they gotten a bad rep in the middle of this?
Well, um, I don't want to come across as I'm defending anybody, but in this particular instance, I know a lot of people are concerned that the pharmaceutical companies were taking advantage of this situation. But you have to remember, it was the governments and the regulators that approached these companies, and they worked with them to tell them what they needed to do to get these products on the market. So the reduction in the amount of data that they submitted was all dictated by the regulators. Now, there are a lot of things that companies do in part of their strategies, like picking that new technology. But in this case, it was the most expedient way to get vaccines produced. Um, I know that pharmaceuticals get a bad rap. I worked for a company, Connaught, and all the other two companies, and I can say that those companies were upfront. Of course, vaccine companies are, because they know what they're doing is to prevent people from getting sick. But not working for the other companies, I can't answer whether they're doing things correctly or not. But all I can say is they did exactly what the regulators asked of them. They met the requirements that the regulators put before them, and they are continuing to provide. It's really the government's decision whether or not they use these vaccines or not. So they're in this loop as much as the pharmaceuticals.
Well, so let me put you on the spot here, Susan. So you are the regulator in your company. The government comes to you in a pandemic and they say, listen, we need you to produce a vaccine. Okay, whatever you want, we'll do it. What do you ask for?
Well, I think I would ask for exactly what they did, which is we need to be able to do things in parallel, not in sequence. Allow us to generate the data, the minimum amount of data to get approval, while we continue to commit to do more work as time goes on and collect the data as it's being, used in the marketplace. That, as a career regulatory person, you are to look for various opportunities within the regulations to expedite review. You also look for opportunities to take advantage of to get your products out as quick as possible. And this pandemic did allow some new technologies to be tested in the real world that may have taken another few years, maybe even decades, to get on the market. So if I was that regulatory person, the most you can do is ensure safety. And that's
Mm.
something that I don't think companies compromise on, because it will come back later. If these things are not safe, then it's their reputation. So safety is the most important. Efficacy is probably something that you can watch over the several years.
So it ties right into here. David says this: why are the vaccinations being called safe and effective? How can any government or medical authority continue to sanction and push the use of vaccines and boosters? This is an important point with regards to the pushing of it as well, because this is not being done by the pharmaceutical industry. Who is responsible for that?
Okay, so the question is a good one. I think part of the approval process, this emergency, is to continually look at data, continually look at the safety data, continually to look at the efficacy data. That is a role of the FDA and Health Canada in conjunction with the pharmaceutical. But the reports of adverse events and breakthroughs, they all go to the public health groups. They're the ones collecting the data. They have to review it. They have to determine whether there are any signals. It's not, at this point, it's not really the company's responsibility, it is the government. But this is where data availability, where the public needs to start seeing more of the data coming from the public health, so that they're assured that somebody's looking at what's going on in the community.
So Sonita says this, do you think there is a good safety monitoring system in place? And let me ask you this important question along that line, Susan, because we keep on hearing that there are signals coming up in VAERS, but then we also hear that VAERS is not necessarily the best system to look for signals. So then what is, if it's not that? You know, how does that fit together?
Okay, so these monitoring systems are looking at adverse events or conditions that a doctor would determine is related to the vaccination. So that monitoring system is only as good as the physician that files the report. So it's up to the physicians and the hospitals to file a report of what they think is an adverse event. When it's long-term events, like long-term, let's say you start seeing signals of increased cancers or something, that really isn't part of the monitoring the vaccine. It's usually adverse events that occur within the first 28 days. But as you start moving out beyond the dose itself, it becomes more difficult to determine if there's signals. That's a different group that start looking at what was the norm for cancers before vaccine, and have they started to see increases. And I'm just giving you that as an example. I'm not saying that's happened. I'm just saying that is not part of the drug surveillance system. That becomes more of the public health looking at that. And they have to look for signs and signals that there's certain things, certain conditions are on an increase, and determine what is common to those people. That's how they determine smoking causes lung cancer, for instance. And so it takes years to figure that out. So I think, just to quickly answer the question, the monitoring systems that are in place for vaccines are as good as they get. But what everybody's concerned about is long-term events that may not be picked up by that system.
So is it fair when people say that, say, for instance, a government would say there are no safety flags, the vaccines are safe, just take it, so to speak. That's been the push across the world, certainly for vaccines and boosters. Is that actually good practice in terms of saying that? Because we don't know longer term safety signals. And that's one thing people have been saying. Is that fair?
Well, I'll give you a bit of a description of what should be happening. Both the FDA and Canada state that these drugs, these vaccines, and there's some drugs that have been released under the Emergency Use Act or the interim order, that the people receiving them need to be aware that they were released under emergency order. They also have the right to reject or accept the vaccine. These are all in the regulations for these emergency releases. And it also says the person that is being offered the vaccine needs to know the risk benefits that are known and what is not known. For instance, there are no data in pregnant women. There are no data in lactating women. There are no data in immune compromised individuals, for instance. And those are in the monographs that are put out by the pharmaceutical companies. Those monographs are available on the regulators' websites. How many people know to go look at that? Right? So that's all they have to do. They list them on their websites. Anybody can go to their website and look up the product monograph. It will tell you what data there is, what data there's not, and then you make an informed decision whether you want the product or not. That is right in the regulations. I guess what people are questioning is a lot of the vaccines are not being given by the physician. They're not talking to their physician. They're going to clinics to get these vaccines. So they're not given the monograph to read. They're not told what's in there and what's not in there. So that is, and I know I'm going to get in a lot of trouble for this, but I mean, that is the concern I have, that I don't think people are being allowed to make the informed decisions that are actually required by law.
Mhm. So this is an important point then, is that within that proviso, with what you said, therefore, how is it possible that it could be mandated? I don't understand. How, with that kind of legal structure with regards to the regulations, how can we get to a situation where the say for instance in the US there were mandates, people were losing their jobs and so on because of this. How does that happen? How is that
Well,
bypassed?
that has nothing to do with the regulators. The regulators and the companies did their jobs. They have been very upfront with the claim for the claim. The claim says it's to prevent disease. It didn't say anywhere in there that it prevents infection or spread. They didn't look at that. That wasn't their endpoints. They're very upfront with what data they have and what data they don't have. They put warnings and contradictions, that contraindications. So that comes from the regulators and the company. The people that have made the decisions about the mandates are not the regulators. They are the Minister of Health and the Prime Minister or the President and their health minister. The decisions about the mandates and who's getting the vaccines are not coming from the regulators. So you have to separate the companies and the regulators from the politicians.
So
Those
this is a
mandates.
question. Yeah, so this is a question that I sometimes come across: decision without responsibility. So who then is responsible if there are problems? If it's not the regulators, it's not the pharmaceutical industry, and the politicians change every few years. So who is responsible?
Well, I think they're just trying to figure that out because this is a very unusual situation. We have never had, I mean, when we had the SARS, when there was the Ebola, we never got to the point where there was, the pandemic spread all over the world and millions of people were dying and the hospitals were being tied up. The politicians are doing the best to protect, society. And they've made decisions based on, advice from a number of people. They have, science tables. So the regulators, all they can do is be sure that everything is done according to the book, that the information is put in the public documents, and they are monitoring the side effects and efficacy. Well, not efficacy so much, but the adverse events. That's what they're looking at, is adverse events. So they're doing all that. It's where there is maybe a, I don't know, disconnect between them and the politicians. That's where, and I'm not even sure if the politicians know all the processes that are going on to get something to market. And you have to
So
remember, there was a lot of pressure all over the world. It started with the U.S. with President Trump saying he was going to have these vaccines available. It was going to stop the pandemic. And then the rest of the world just followed suit. And I think it's out of panic, fear that these decisions have been made. But we cannot blame the regulators. And you have to have the confidence in the regulators. And it's not them that put those mandates out. They would never do that. That's not in their, they don't have the authority to do that.
but yes, I understand they don't have the authority, but don't they have the responsibility to challenge the government if the government is doing something that is clearly not within the normal practice? And this is what I'm saying. Who is responsible to challenge that?
Okay, so when the regulators say the product is safe, they have looked at all the data and they believe it's safe. So when they say safe, they mean the risk benefit, profile is there, that there is enough benefit to overcome any risks that might be there. They're not saying it is completely without risk. They're just saying that it's safe. So the word safe is, it's something that means something different in every situation. So they're not saying it's without any risks. The word safe means it's safe enough in the situation we're in. So I think when the government says it's safe, they're just repeating what the FDA is saying, that it's safe. But what I'm not really sure about is how the FDA and Health Canada are monitoring that people are receiving the informed consent that's right in the interim order and the emergency use approval process. Because if doctors are not giving the vaccine, they're not getting the monograph, they're not discussing it with their patients, it's the government that's pushing patients to go get their shots and saying it's safe and it's safe in everyone. It's hard to know why they're doing that when there's some groups of people where they don't have any data and it says that right in the monograph.
Hmm. So I mean, this is where I think we have done quite significant damage to public health across the world. Is that we one of the things that have an issue with is that we are not differentiating the risk benefit based on the health profiles. Now, it's very obvious from the data that certain groups are much more at risk for severe COVID-19, and that's older age, certain comorbidities. And to be frank, the US data suggested that only 3% of the deaths in COVID-19 were people who had no comorbidities. So when you look at that, how do you put across this risk benefit to an individual? Because it is very different for somebody who has heart disease, diabetes, and kidney failure versus a 26-year-old who has nothing wrong with them. How do you get that balance?
Well, that's a very good question. And that's, I think, why it has right in the regs that each person has to make their own decision about their risk benefit. So let's say that, but let's say that there's somebody that is healthy. They're not going anywhere. They're working from home. They're having their food delivered to their house. They're not exposing themselves to the virus. The risk benefit in that person is completely different from the elderly person that's living in a congregate setting, and they have comorbidities. So in the normal situations with vaccines, if it's something like shingles or the flu vaccine, each person makes that judgment for themselves. But there are vaccines in children like polio and pertussis and measles and mumps where it is the risk to the children getting that disease is there for all of them because it's a communicable disease and it will happen in children if they're not vaccinated. So sometimes they do make decisions for the masses. And in schools, that's exactly what's happening. And this mass protection or the mass vaccination is herd immunity. They're looking at, is everybody's vaccinated, or at least a high percentage of them are vaccinated, we should end up protecting the whole society. That doesn't appear to be happening, however. I mean, we're still getting the spread in vaccinated people. So that's where the governments have to start looking at maybe changing their approach, because it's not working the same way as polio or tetanus or any of those other vaccines.
So this is another question that I wondered about, is that what do you do as a regulator in a company? You've created the vaccine, you are trying to stop the disease or the infection. It's not happening the way that you expected. When do you go back to the drawing board, so to speak? Or do you just keep on going?
No, I think there's evidence that they've already gone back to the drawing board by coming up with new vaccines for new variants. And a lot of companies are starting to look at, should we have a nasal vaccine? We've got, I think, vaccine just recently was approved for the whole protein vaccine, right? So using the older technology. So I think as a regulatory person, you're also responsible for filing on an annual basis safety reviews and efficacy reviews of your new products. So the regulatory person of the company would be doing that. They would take that to their medical department and point out anything that they think is going, not going the way you expected based on the limited clinical trials that you did. You bring that to your medical group. They would then take it to the research group and they would go back and say, how can we tweak this product, or do we need to come up with a new product? But that is a regulatory responsibility, is to make sure that you are working with the clinical group, your pharmacology group, and you're looking at these reports and seeing whether the profile you thought you had for the product is not the same. And if there are safety signals, you're then into a recall. If you start seeing safety signals that are concern to you and the regulators, then you're talking about recall. But I don't think that's where we are, right? I know we're not there. We're not at a recall stage, but efficacy is not necessarily a recall situation. It just means it's not working as well as you thought, which means you have to tweak, and you might have to add an adjuvant, or, there's things that you end up doing. But each of those changes has to go through another approval process. You have to do more clinical trials and go through that whole approval process to get that change approved. It's like a brand new vaccine if you change it.
So it raises again another point, because I made this point recently. People say the vaccine doesn't work. And I say, actually, what we know is that if the vaccine has been given, in the majority of people, there's a strong antibody response to the spike protein. So the vaccine works. The question is, though, the vaccine doesn't seem to be able to stop the spread of the disease. What would you be thinking if you were inside one of these companies now? What would be going through your head?
Okay, I think somebody asked a question about, can clinical trials be designed to be positive? And as a regulatory person, I'd be looking at what is the easiest endpoint to demonstrate, and what is the endpoint that we will be most likely to demonstrate. The companies chose the reduction in hospitalizations and death. They never did demonstrate that the vaccines reduced infection and spread or spread. So that wasn't expected from the regulators or the companies. I don't know how it got to be the messaging that, this was going to stop the pandemic, because they never demonstrated that it would stop spread. So as the regulatory person in that company, I'd say the vaccine's doing what we said it would do, which is to reduce hospitalizations, severe disease, and deaths. It is
Mm.
doing that. It appears to be doing that in the real world setting.
And so that raises again another question that I had. I couldn't figure out, when we first had the first wave of the pandemic, we everyone was talking about lockdowns to protect the vulnerable. Okay. Somewhere between October 2020 and December 2020, it changed to herd immunity. Who did that if it wasn't the pharmaceutical people?
I'm asking that question myself. I can't find where that first started, because the reason why I am so familiar with what's been happening with these vaccines is because I started, after I retired, becoming an advisor to our Ontario health teams as an advocate for the patients and caregivers. And I was asked many times, should I get this vaccine? And these were seniors. Should I get these vaccines when they become available? And at the time, that's all it was for: seniors and vulnerable people. So I was giving them, contacts and making sure that they could get in and get their shots. It was soon after that they started to lower the ages. They went from over 70, over 80, and then over 75, and then over 65. And then they made the vaccines available to people in their 40s. I don't know why that changed. I don't know why it changed, but these vaccines were originally brought out to make sure that the people that were at the highest risk of going into the hospital and dying would be protected. So I don't know when it switched from that to now we're right down to the young kids now. Like, I don't
Yes.
know when that happened. And I don't know why it happened. I can't answer that. I'm only focusing on the regulations and not the politics.
So when we look at that, then, so just imagine, in a normal circumstance, here you have a disease that primarily affects older adults with comorbidities. how do you do the justification for vaccinating children if it doesn't focus on stopping the spread of the disease, which is the purpose of vaccinating the children in the first place? How does that work?
Well, okay, here's two points in this. We're talking about the spread, but reported cases are usually, right now, at least in Canada, seems to be based on positive PCR tests. So a lot of people don't have symptoms, but they happen to test positive. That is not disease. Remember, the vaccine was approved to prevent disease. Disease means symptoms. Disease does not mean viral load. Disease does not mean you're spreading it. So I think society is monitoring numbers based on positive PCR tests when the vaccine wasn't meant to affect that. The vaccine was meant to keep people out of hospitals. That's what it was for. And so the risk benefit of keeping a person out of a hospital is much different than giving a vaccine that reduces spread. But that's not what these vaccines were for, not these current ones. There might be others coming down the road that, would prevent spread. But that's not what these were developed for. And the emergency that the world saw was deaths, taking up hospital beds. I mean, that was the emergency. If all you had was a bit of a cold, who cares? But we were trying to reduce those things. And that's what the emergency releases were put out there for. And that's why I said the regulators and the government seem to be talking different sides of their face.
So here we have a situation where there's strong evidence that the vaccines reduce the risk for severe disease. Okay, yet we have part of the world taking all the vaccines to give boosters, including to children, when other parts who have vulnerable people don't have enough vaccines for those people. What are the ethics in that?
I can't answer the ethics of that. All I know is when the vaccines appeared to be losing efficacy, then the thing that you do is then you boost. I mean, you do that with polio vaccine, especially if you don't know the immune profile of an individual. Not everybody's going to respond to a vaccine. So if it's immune compromised, somebody with not a strong immune system, you need to boost even with the vaccines that have been around for a long time. Those studies weren't really done. They didn't have the time. The studies were like 28 days. So they gave vaccines to these people. They took antibodies, T cells and B cells. They looked at that. They looked at how many of those actually had neutralizing antibodies. And within 28 days, how many actually went into the hospital. So there was no study of the long-term effects. How long does the antibodies last for? Like none of that was done because of the rush to get these on the market. But they're doing those studies now. Like those studies are being done now. They had to continue to do studies, even as part of this emergency use application. So these data will start to come, but it takes time. If you're going to take thousands of people and monitoring them for a year to see how many of them start losing their antibodies, and how many of them that were vaccinated went into the hospital, that's going to take time, which they didn't
So,
have.
yeah. So one of the other questions is that if you have set up your study and you're looking at the difference between the groups, your placebo group and your treatment group, why would you then choose to give the vaccine to your placebo group?
It
Is
became,
that
I think it becomes an ethical or moral issue. It's probably more of a moral issue that these people are in a trial. You've demonstrated based on your data that there is a significant, and we're talking about statistically significant now versus maybe statistically significant benefit to being vaccinated when the trial is over. So you're not monitoring them anymore. Like they had, their protocol said the trial finished at 28 days. So you offer placebo people, do you want the vaccine? The data demonstrate that you got, so they didn't know they got placebo. It's
Yes.
randomized, blinded. So those in the trial were hoping they would get the vaccine. So the ones that got the placebo, you go back to them and say, well, the trial's over. We don't need you anymore. We're not taking any more samples from you. Would you like the vaccine? That quite often is done. It's called a crossover, so that you offer the people that were in the placebo something that actually has been demonstrated to work. You wouldn't offer it if you had already demonstrated it didn't work, but they had demonstrated it worked.
So it raises, therefore, another part of the question where I'm focused, and that's to do with all cause mortality. Now, as far as I know, both in drugs and in vaccines, at the end of the day, you are trying to save lives. Who is responsible for following all cause mortality if there are inadvertent effects that can happen later on?
Well, that actually is the government watching for that, because um, when the trials are over, they lose these subjects. I mean, because now you have no control over them. Once the trial is over, you have no way to follow that. All cause mortality would have been captured in that 28-day follow up. So the clinical trials themselves would have captured all cause mortality. And if it happened in the 28 days and there was a statistical significant difference, then that would be part of that safety profile. But I don't believe that they saw that. And in 28 days, that's pretty short term. So the mortalities they saw were usually, caused by the COVID or complications of COVID, because they were only really looking at the ones that were hospital. Now, remember, they were hospitalized with COVID.
Mhm.
So not all of them went into the hospital because of COVID. They were tested positive once they went into emerge, and then were taken into the hospital. So they were with, but there's still a lot more numbers in the placebo group than in the vaccinated group.
I'm going to show you a graph here, and this is the kind of thing that I'm focused on and I'm trying to understand. So this is Euromomo graph, which is showing mortality, excess mortality across all ages. And I'm looking at this. This is for 2021. And so we can, well, this is all the years. So 2021 is in blue, yellow is 2019, and 2020 is in gray. And we can see here, which is what the pandemic happened. It goes up and then it goes and it hits the number up here. But when you look at all cause mortality for 2021, you see this continuous trend up. And actually, we've only saved about, I think it's 40,000 people, so to speak, across all ages. And I'm thinking to myself, who is responsible for keeping an eye on this in case there are things that we miss? Do you sometimes see that in the context of vaccine development where there are inadvertent complications that you hadn't really thought of?
That's a really good question. So the responsibility for monitoring things like that is your public health, because you have to remember during that time, a lot of monitoring for cancers and heart disease were all put on hold because of the pandemic. I know people now that are starting to have real problems with their health because they couldn't get in for diagnostic tests. They
Mhm.
couldn't get to see their doctor. So there can be a lot of reasons for those increases, and it may not be that, it may be just coincidental that it happened at the time of the vaccine introduction. But there were a lot of other things that weren't happening, and there's mental health issues. There are people taking, taking stimulants, all kinds of things, gone back to smoking because of their depression. There's a lot of things that are happening, but that's the public health's responsibility to monitor for that and then try to sort out what could be causing that blip. So that's not the companies. The companies wouldn't be seeing that. They wouldn't be
Mhm.
seeing those data at all. And the regulators wouldn't be seeing those data. That's public health. The only ones would see those data is if a doctor said, I believe that this person had an adverse event to the vaccine, they submit that adverse event report to the company and to the government. But if something happens 6 months after vaccine, more than likely they will say non-related, because they wouldn't
Mhm.
expect something. So it'd be the public health that would start to see the signals, right? They would
So,
start to see the signals. And you have to look at the bump has to be a comparison from the norm 5 years ago or 3 years ago. So that's how they look at the data. But it will take 1 or 2 years to start really sorting that out.
mhm. I think as we come to the close here, Susan, I want to ask you a bit of questions about my focus in terms of research. So, I've always said that COVID-19 is a viral mediated autoimmune disease, meaning that the virus is not what's causing the lung damage that causes people to die. It's almost like a switch. In some people, it switches on the immune system, and like a bee sting, they get a very severe response, and that can cause them to die. It's kind of like a vaccine in an autoimmune disease. Have we ever done that before?
Well, I'm not aware. I mean, they were having a hard time with the AIDS vaccine, which actually I was involved in the research for that. It cannot, but that's the opposite. That's a virus that causes immune deficiency.
Mhm.
So it really is. If it's too bad we couldn't get a lot of data for that to show that if you can stop the virus, you'll stop that. But I would think if you could actually stop the virus from spreading beyond the nasal, the mucosal, then you won't get those other reactions. It's once it gets into the body, then you have these other reactions. And that is some of the concerns with some of the vaccines, that people that are hesitant to get them because they are now aware through you and others that this might induce an autoimmune response. So could the vaccines do the same thing? Without knowing much about that, there are a lot of people that are concerned about that. And that's some of the hesitancies that are out there, because there's so many other things that are causing these immune, the environment, the things we eat. So to add one more thing to the body just concerns a lot of people. But I have never seen, I'm not aware, maybe some of your listeners, our
Mhm.
viewers, know of a vaccine for a virus that causes an autoimmune condition or immune response. I'm not aware of any.
Wonderful, wonderful. So I think the point that we have seen from the picture that we've had this discussion, Susan, is that it seems that the vaccine does the job of preventing severe disease in the high risk people. And what I have always said, I can't understand why this simple message can't go out from public health, which is simple. If you are on medication, you have certain comorbidities, and you haven't previously had COVID-19, you probably would benefit from having a vaccine. And it's as simple as that is the important point in terms of differentiating risk for people to understand. And that in the high risk group, even if there are longer term risks, we can possibly mitigate them, assuming that you survive COVID-19, if that makes any sense. And so I think that we have a long way to go to rebuild trust in the pharmaceutical industry, in public health. That's going to be a challenge. Any final thoughts, Susan?
I think the only thing I would say is it's just unfortunate that the pharmaceutical companies, especially those with the new technology, used this particular disease to develop those new technologies, because it is so controversial, so political, that they have now gotten caught up in all of this. And it still bothers me that people blame the companies and blame the regulators for the so-called spread, and they're saying the vaccines don't work. All they have to be reminded is that's not what the vaccines were developed for. That's not what they were approved for. Something else happened to make the public say these are not working because people are still spreading and getting the disease. But I'm not sure they're actually getting the disease. They're testing positive, but
Mhm.
that doesn't mean that they're actually getting the disease. So all of this is so confusing for your average person, that the messaging is so important, that this is where the governments around the world have to step up and start explaining what these products were approved for and what their claims are, so that people stop blaming the regulators and the companies, because that's not where the blame is, if there's any blame to be had at all.
Excellent. Wow. I thank you so much, Susan. There were so many things that I think we could probably go on for, but we've gone an hour and 15 minutes going through this. So this is absolutely gold dust in terms of helping people to understand the process. Really, really appreciate it, Susan. Thank you very much for being with us. And I'll just ask you to hang on while I do this quick outro. Thank you, everyone, for watching with us again. And I hope this was of value to you. It was certainly of tremendous interest and value to me. Until the next interview, have a great evening.
Thank you.